Welcome to this third in a series of videos on the Nameauth package for use with the LaTeX document preparation system. I'm using version 1.7. When the names of historical people are mentioned in the package documentation and in these videos, they reflect the way the users will employ this package. However, I'm not attempting to say anything positive or negative regarding the historical gravitas, the context, the culture, the traditions of these people that are mentioned herein. I'm simply picking up names that I have encountered during my studies and professional activity, and I'm using them to illustrate the features of this package. I would ask the patience and the understanding of the readers and the viewers in this regard. The Nameauth package has long forms of the naming macros that include name, fname, and name star. The short forms also are synonyms for these longer forms, and they are set up with the Nameauth environment. The Nameauth environment contains lines that start with a control sequence of an open angle bracket and are terminated with a closed angle bracket. And this command has 4 arguments. Each argument is delimited with an ampersand. The first argument sets up 3 control sequences, in this case wash, lwash, and swash, L for long, S for short. Wash is a synonym for name George Washington. Lwash is a synonym for name star George Washington. Swash is a synonym for fname George Washington. And here we associate the optional forename, mandatory surname, thus George Washington. And this argument is empty, but it still needs to be represented on the line. Thus we need to have 3 ampersands. If we forget an ampersand, the package will generate an error. What happens is that the leading and trailing spaces of the arguments are trimmed off. So therefore, simply an argument with an empty space there is going to become the empty string and therefore will not be included when the synonyms to the longer macros are created. Over in the right-hand column, we see where the number of required and optional arguments can collapse to the shortest form, that is to say, a backslash open angle bracket, required argument, 2 ampersands, required argument, ampersand, closed angle bracket. And we have examples of that here. For example, we have Aristotle, and that is the shortest form that we'll see in the Nameauth environment. So if we set up link as a synonym for Abraham Lincoln, the first reference to link will give us that long version where Abraham Lincoln is in small caps. The second reference to link will give us a reference simply to the surname Lincoln, no special formatting. Remember, L-link is a synonym for the starred form of name, and so we get that longer reference again, Abraham Lincoln. Finally, S-link is a synonym to fname Abraham Lincoln, and that gives us that short reference to the forename Abraham. The long forms of the macros usually do not require an open-close brace pair after them, especially to preserve a trailing space. The short forms of the macros do need an open-close brace pair if you want to preserve the trailing space. That's standard behavior for TeX and LaTeX. However, there is a case in which you want to use the pair of braces with the longer macros. Let's, for example, assume that we want to refer to George Washington and we want to have a parenthetical reference. So we'll put C below in brackets. Instead of getting George Washington space brackets C below, we get C below Washington. And that's because the text in brackets has been pulled in as if it were a final argument. To prevent that, we need to insert the pair of braces, and now we have a reference to George Washington C below, which is what we wanted in the first place. However, we do want that kind of ambiguity, and the next topic, which will be nicknames, shows us why we want that sort of ambiguity. So even though it might be a pain in some cases to have this pair of braces, nevertheless, it's useful in a larger number of situations. Nicknames are a form of alternate forename. For example, if you wanted to refer to H.L. Mencken in the index or throughout the body text, but wanted to have, say, a longer reference to his name, such as Henry Louis Mencken, the first time he shows up, you can do that with this alternate forename or nickname function. Henry Louis will replace the HL in the reference in the name macros. And so, for example, if we go here and remove Henry Louis, then in the body text we'll get HL. So that is that nickname function that I've mentioned before. Now remember, if there are no forenames given, then that wouldn't be a nickname, it would be a suffix. So remember, you have to have the forenames in the name reference here. In this case, it's the initials HL. You have to have that in there in order for the nickname to do the replacement properly. Something similar occurs with the shorter macros. For example, if we have a reference to L-link with Abe in brackets immediately following it, then we wind up with a reference in the body text to Abe Lincoln instead of Abraham Lincoln. So you see, that's where that ambiguity actually is helpful for us, because we can choose to put that final optional argument there, or we can choose to leave it off. And whether we have it or whether we don't have it, it doesn't matter. So that's kind of a good thing in that regard, that ambiguity. Now there is a case when we use nicknames that is a bit of a difficult kind of a special case. It is the case when normally you have an individual whose official name has a suffix, such as John David Rockefeller IV. And here we have a reference to JRIV, which is his official name, John David Rockefeller IV. However, he normally goes by J. Rockefeller. In order to refer to him by J. Rockefeller in a subsequent reference, we have to use a special form, namely SJR space JR, and we have to have that pair of braces there to preserve that trailing space, and we'll get J. Rockefeller when we do that. Otherwise, if we simply say JR, we get a reference to Rockefeller. LJR will refer to J. Rockefeller IV. Now, I didn't want to have a switch that turns on and off suffixes, because sometimes the suffixes might stand for forenames or sobriquets or other sorts of references that we do not want to accidentally turn off. So therefore, this workaround was developed as a way in which you can get that functionality of J. Rockefeller, but not have that suffix show up. Now, if we try to generate a first reference to JR, it will show up not as John David Rockefeller IV, but as J. Rockefeller IV, because the nickname always replaces the forenames, even in a first reference. So if you wanted to generate a first reference to J. Rockefeller and not to John David Rockefeller IV or J. Rockefeller IV, either you would have to decide that you're not going to use the suffix, or there is a rather specialized workaround. What you do is you set up a group, because the formatting needs to happen in an isolated scope. So you set up a group, for example, with a braces pair here, and then you invoke the names format function. By doing that, you will essentially tell the Nameauth package to format the following name as if it were a first reference to a name regardless. Then you invoke subvert name. And what that says is treat the name syntactically as a subsequent reference. And then we have to put in this case, the name John David Rockefeller IV, because that is the way in which we have it set up. And then we put in the reference to SJR, which will give us that first name J. We have the pair of braces and the space, and then finally a reference to JR, which will give us Rockefeller with no suffix. So that's how you can have that reference to somebody with a suffix without it showing up in the body text, but nevertheless you could still include it in the index. So again, Nameauth tries to give you a fair amount of flexibility in the body text, and yet for all of this variation, whether it's Abraham or Abe, or whether it's John David or Jay, we see that the index references do not change. They are stable. And so again, it's trying to achieve this goal of flexibility and stability. Usually you don't have to use some of these squirrely workarounds, but they're there in case you need them. And again, the reason why you have to use it in this case is because some alternative workarounds might seem quicker and easier, but they would defeat the purpose of allowing you to move text around and have you not worry, did you turn on or turn off this or that switch kind of thing, and therefore give you an editorial headache as you're dealing with your manuscript. So that essentially covers the common and less common issues regarding nicknames and the short naming macros. We will discuss particles and other naming aspects in the subsequent video. Thanks for watching.